I'd like to share a little bit about who I am and how I, as a male, came to be deeply involved in women's issues. I went to university in Toronto, Canada, where I majored in sociology and I minored in women's studies. After university, I spent years in immersive travel around the world. In every culture, I noticed that there were varying levels of gender equality. And as a result, I noticed also there were kind of feminist movements in most countries. Now, what was interesting is that in each country, there were different approaches to feminism, creating different levels of harmony, success, and failure between the genders in each country. Now, throughout my life, I've also worked on practical projects promoting gender equality. I created several web resources for women. One is a reproductive rights website that has been accessed by over 1 million women around the world. I also created a natural birth control and family planning site and a book on feminist entrepreneurship. In 2004, I moved to Hawaii, where I started an eco-tourist community. And in 2014, it evolved into the Hedonisia Hawaii EcoFeminist Community. Now at Hedonisia, I was able to test out international ideas of feminism that I observed when I was traveling around the world. I observed certain things that were successful and I implemented them into the community. And many of those ideas turned out to be successful. Hedonisia was a thriving community. It drew visitors from around the world. However, the dream ended in 2018 when the Kilauea volcano erupted and destroyed my home and the entire community. In fact, in the background, there's my property right now, under the rainbow, that green spot surrounded by lava. So that's where my place is now. After the eruption, I moved to Portland, Oregon, which is labeled by the TV show Portlandia as the most feminist city in America. And it was in Portland that during the pandemic, I started writing the book Warrior Woman, which is the foundation for these presentations. Now, even though I'm the author of the book, over 50 women and a few men of all ages and ethnicities from around the world have been volunteer editors on this manuscript. So it's not just me mansplaining feminism. I have a great deal of my research has been sourced from female writers, academics, and thinkers. Now, today, I divide my time between trying to rebuild my home in Hawaii and living in Montreal, which in 2025 is my favorite city in the world. I've observed gender division and gender harmony throughout the world. Through it all, one idea has stayed with me, that men and women need each other. True equality can't come from division or domination. And this is why I created Yin-Yang Feminism. It's a vision of balance, cooperation, and respect between the sexes. I'm excited to share this with you and to hear your thoughts and experiences. So, the term féminisme, I'm pronouncing it with the French accent, first appeared in France in the 1830s. Interestingly, the word was created by a man. His name was Charles Fourier. He was a utopian socialist who used the word feminism not as a political battle cry, but as part of a broader vision of human harmony. Fourier believed that the degree of a society's civilization could be measured by the freedom and dignity that it granted to women. His vision of feminism was complementary, rooted in cooperation between the sexes. However, when the word feminism migrated to the English-speaking world, it changed. It moved over to the English-speaking world in the late 19th century. And then it began to acquire a far more adversarial and political tone. The focus shifted from Fourier's vision of philosophical equality of genders to a legal and ideological struggle between the genders. So while French feminism began as a cooperative ideal, Anglo-American feminism became a revolutionary one, a movement that was defined by resistance rather than reconciliation. In 1848, there was a Declaration of Sentiments at the Seneca Falls Convention of Women in New York. This document is widely considered by many historians as the founding document of modern feminism, or what became known as the first wave of feminism in the United States. It was modeled on the US Declaration of Independence. The Declaration of Sentiments painted a picture where men were the oppressors and women were the oppressed. The Declaration listed a series of grievances against men. Some of the key lines in the Declaration were having deprived her of this first right of a citizen, the elective franchise, thereby leaving her without representation in the halls of legislation. He has oppressed her on all sides. He, meaning men, has made her, if married, in the eye of the law, civilly dead. Now, these are just a couple of examples. There's a whole list of them. And when reading through it, there is nothing positive to be said about men in that first declaration. As a result, this adversarial framing helped fuel legal and political victories for women, but it also planted from the very beginning the seeds of polarization that continue to this day. Now, there was much truth in many of the grievances that the Declaration listed. Women faced genuine equality in voting rights, property rights, and marriage laws, for instance. However, the historical reality was far more complex. The Declaration ignored the reality that men were also shouldering immense risks and sacrifices, which often resulted in shorter lifespans for men. There was little acknowledgement in the Declaration of men as partners or allies. Instead, men were portrayed almost exclusively as oppressors. The irony is that many of the women in that convention and many of the early feminists, they were not poor or powerless. They were often educated, middle or upper class women who lived longer, healthier, and more privileged lives than the average man of that time. So some of the notable feminists of that time were Susan B. Anthony. She was born in 1820. She lived till 86. Elizabeth Cady Stanton, born in 1815. She lived till 87. Charlotte Woodward Pierce, born in 1830. She lived till 91. And on the other side of the Atlantic, a similar thing was happening with the early English feminists. Melissa Fawcett, born in 1847, she lived till 82. And Josephine Butler, born in 1828, she lived till 78. Now, men at that time, especially working class, they often died young due to war, hard labor, and poor health conditions. The average life male expectancy in that time in the 19th century was roughly 38 to 44 years. It only rose to 53 by 1920, which is when women got the right to vote in America. So many of these early feminists lived even longer than people today, despite all the medical technologies we have. US life expectancy in 2021 is about 77 years. In the UK, it's about 81 years. So all those feminists that I listed, they lived longer than the average person today. So that's the first part. Let me just take a quick pause to check in and see if there's any questions or comments at this time.
Yes, my question, you talk about the age of the women that were living at that time, but I feel like feminism was not only about the living, but more about the condition and the right that they were in. They could live about 90 years old despite the men and the working class working 30, but the forced marriage and stuff like that was the oppression. And that
Yes.
was not equal.
Oh, absolutely. Everything you just said, totally legitimate. I mean, that was one of the reasons why many of those upper class women were looking at women in lower classes as well, and using their privilege to advocate for them. So yes, what you're saying is genuinely true. The focus, though, was that by ignoring the reality of men completely, it set up the conditions for an adversarial framing. There is absolutely no doubt in the world, and including I noticed in my travels, that all over the world, women are not equal to men. They do suffer.
Mm-hmm.
But the framing of it is where the clash started to occur.
Okay, yeah, I see. And at what date you say the vote for Americans was? Because
For American women, it was 1920, I believe, and English women, it was 1922, or vice versa, one or the other. But it was basically at that time. I think New Zealand gave women a right to vote first, but those two, and then most of the other European countries followed around that time, basically between the two wars, after World War I, but before World War II. Many women.
Except for France, I think, because it's the only date that I remember from my
Oh,
history class, and it was
tell me.
1944.
Are you serious?
Yes, I think Europeans, we are, and French people, of course, we abolished the guillotine in 1986, something like that, which is crazy too. But French
That is, yes, yeah, guillotine.
it was crazy. But yeah, I just wanted to check on the compared to the American and the British where we were headed, and well, it's all the three of them is bad, but that's enough.
Right. Yeah, no, that is a very good point. There is a long history of male sacrifice for female protection, even before women got the right to vote. So, for example, in the Titanic disaster of 1912, after the ship struck the iceberg and was going down, the principle of women and children first determined who got on the lifeboats. In the Titanic disaster, overall, only about 20% of men survived compared to 74% of women. The expectation was clear. Men would give their lives to save women and children. And when the early feminists described men as oppressors, those men included the factory workers who were dying in their 40s, coal miners who were coughing up their lungs, and soldiers who never returned from war. Even in modern times, we see structural imbalances that show men carry very heavy risks to life and liberty. In terms of homelessness, the vast majority of homeless populations in Western countries are male. In the US, around 60 to 70% of the homeless are men. In prison sentencing, studies consistently show that women receive lighter prison sentences than men for the same crimes. Men are more likely to be incarcerated for longer terms. Suicide rates, globally, men are about 3 to 4 more times more likely to die by suicide than women. In US, roughly 80% of suicides are male. And in dangerous jobs, over 90% of workplace fatalities involve men. Construction, logging, mining, fishing remain overwhelmingly male with the highest death rates. And in war, Both before and after females gained the right to vote, men were drafted into armies and sent to die in staggering numbers. In the American Civil War, an estimated 620,000 soldiers died, mostly men. In World War I, over 9 million soldiers died, again, mostly men. The adversarial tone of that original declaration ignored a lot of these inequalities in terms of what men would do, the burdens that men carried. And it has carried into modern feminism of today, where men are portrayed primarily as perpetrators and women primarily as victims. Men are assumed to be privileged simply by virtue of being male, while women are presumed to be disadvantaged. Now, this one-sided narrative of women as only oppressed and men as only privileged has always been incomplete. The patriarchy in practice was not a single block of men who lived longer, healthier lives at women's expense. It was far more nuanced. Men and women throughout history have carried different burdens, different privileges, and different risks. That's part two. Fire away with any questions or comments.
Yeah, I'm curious about the differences when you talked about different responsibilities, different risks, etc. So the complement. I'm curious. Like, can you give an example?
Well, with the ones that I just said, like with all the different risks that males face in terms of prison sentencing, homelessness, suicide, the jobs that they do. So that's one of the big ones, is that like we've had now about 3 to 4 generations of feminism, and yet the vast majority of workplace deaths, over 90% in most Western countries, are male. And that's just a statistical reality, you know. Okay, Karen, Hiba, did that answer your question? And then I'll move on to Karen.
Yes, and yeah, the female side as well. Like, but maybe through the lecture, I'll pick up a few things as well.
Yeah, and this is a lecture series. Well, presentation, because I don't want to make it sound like a lecture, otherwise it makes me sound like I'm mansplaining. So I'm using the word presentation but yeah, I will be covering some of those issues in later presentations. Karen, go for it.
Okay, I just want to say that in my own experience, I have had experience in traditionally male roles. So I served in the military.
Wow.
Yes, during the Vietnam War, actually. And I, after that, I held a traditionally male job. My career was as a software engineer. And so I totally agree with everything that you've said so far. But what I wanted to add is one of the reasons those statistics are the way they are is that women have traditionally not been allowed to carry the same risks that the men do. So when I was in the military, I was not, at that point in time, it's different now, but at that point in time, women were not allowed in what they called a war zone unless you were a nurse. Nurses were allowed in war zones. Other women doing other jobs were not. And I was in the Navy. Ships and aircrafts were considered war zones. So even if they weren't actually in a battle situation. So I think that, I don't know, I just wanted to point out that one of the reasons why those statistics are skewed the way they are is because of that, because women have traditionally not been allowed to do that sort of thing. And I'm not advocating one way or the other about, you know, my feeling is if a woman wants to go to war, let her go to war.
Right.
But yeah, so.
No, that is a very good point. If I remember correctly from my readings, I think 55,000 men died in the Vietnam War, and I think there was 5 women. But in the Gulf War, the Gulf War II, when a lot more women were serving closer to the front lines, there was about 4,000 male deaths, and I believe 350 female deaths in the Gulf War. So there was a bit of a change in allowing women into more combat. So you're right that in the beginning there was a very strong aversion, especially in military, to having women in certain combat roles.
Yes, and the reason for that is, so when I was in the Navy, I went through a situation where the Navy was trying to get men to be more comfortable with women in the military. And so I was presented as the representative of all women in the Navy to talk to men. So one of the reasons that women have traditionally not been allowed in those situations is exactly what you said. The men feel protective of the women and they don't want them there. They feel like their feeling of protection towards women is a distraction, which it can be very dangerous in a war situation. And like I said, I know that that's changing now, but that was very much the way it was when I was in the military. So I just, like I said, I just wanted to present that additional information.
Oh, absolutely. No, it is a very good point. And there have been certain changes, and in the historical record, there have been times when women were warriors in certain contexts. And in World War II, one of the famous examples is when the Soviet Union was fighting the Nazis. They had communism where the genders were supposed to be equal, at least theoretically, in communism. So it was something where the Soviet Union, what they found is that females can stay still for long periods, because many times women have held children for long periods, fallen asleep with a baby in their arms. So they realized, oh, if we give them guns and put them in trees or hide them in buildings, they will make fantastic snipers. And that is exactly what happened. There was one woman who was in the Russian army. She was called the Schwarzen Hexe by the Germans, and she killed over 300 Nazis. Like the Germans were actually really terrified of the Russian snipers because they were so deadly, and it was quite they were formidable. Asia?
Yes, so I'd like to ask a question. I don't mean it as a criticism of your logic, but I still want to understand, because you are essentially saying that in terms of viability, men suffer much more, right? But feminism is more about equal rights. So rights to make decisions economically, politically, and so on, and viability, slightly different question. And I want to draw a parallel between adults and children, men and women, right? Because, like, for example, you gave the example of the Titanic, where females and children were given priority. And of course, men care about women. For example, biologically, women are important for men, right? Men care for women, similar to how adults care for children. But it is a completely different question from whether or not they're allowed to make political decisions, because, for example, no society allows children to make political decisions at the age of 10. So do you sense my question? There's a certain contradiction between viability and the right to make important decisions for the society.
Yeah, well, there were many women's organizations prior to females getting the vote. And so there was a lot of power, but it was actually called, there were different terms for it. Soft power. There were women's guilds, the women's Christian temperance movement, the abolition of slavery. There were, in fact, many women actually resisted the right to vote because they didn't want to get involved in the nitty-gritty of politics. They wanted to have the moral authority of being above politics and advocating for certain issues that were related to caring. So there was, women did have power prior to the vote. There was in the Western context. It wasn't obviously the same as what males had, but then what men would argue at the time, and that actually relates to what Karen was talking about, is that men got the right to vote, in a sense, only a few decades before women. But one of the reasons why is because men are the ones who went to die in wars. And so they wanted to have a say. And there was the concept, even back in the prior to 1920, that if women got the right to vote, they should also go to war. They should also be soldiers as well. And many women were very resistant against the concept of being able to vote because they didn't want to participate in those male areas. So it is a gray zone. Like the thing about many of these issues, there are trend lines, but of course there are exceptions, which actually brings me to the next section, which is the Yin-Yang feminism, because there is a lot of this overlap. So when I do make these statements, I'm pointing out things, but inherently in that, there are contradictions simply because of the nature of men and women. There are these overlapping aspects. Go ahead.
Yeah, so you're essentially leading to that, what you just said right now, that many women, they didn't want to vote because they felt that it was expected that as a package that they would also have to go to fight, and they did not want the package. They just did, if it was just vote and then completely separate, go to war, they would like choose that, but as a package they didn't want to, right? And this is why you're going to the yin yang, saying that there are inherent differences and it has to be more nuanced. Okay.
Yeah.
Anyway, I'll listen to the next part of the presentation.
No, but thank you for that, because it is a very gray zone, many of these arguments, because I cannot say it's black and white. And in fact, when we go to the yin yang, that's part of the issue.
Sorry, just one thing to add, just because we're talking about the right to vote, but historically also in some societies, for example, it wasn't based on whether you were a male or female, if you had the right to vote, but for example, how much property you had, right?
Yes.
So in a way for voting rights, gender is not the only criteria based on which we would decide. I mean, in some societies, people would decide who has right to vote. So yeah.
That is a very good point. In fact, many men didn't have the right to vote in different societies. That is, it was almost incrementally before women that men got to vote fully.
Yeah.
And so yes, you are 100% right. And but women, one reason why the vote did happen in 1920 was after the World War. And women were in the factories and doing many of these masculine jobs, so-called masculine jobs, and they proved themselves. And then when men came home, they were like, oh, yeah, we've kind of done it now. And so then the franchise was extended to women at that time. The ideological pivot of the French versus American interpretation of feminism, it still echoes today with the tension between complementary and adversarial visions of gender equality. The Eastern approach is the foundation of Yin-Yang feminism, along with the original French usage of the word, which very much aligns with the Yin-Yang approach. It begins with a recognition that both halves of humanity, male and female, masculine and feminine, are necessary and worthy of respect. Balance comes not from erasing grievances, but from acknowledging them, men's and women's alike. In the Indian tradition, this balance is described as the interplay between the masculine Shiva and the feminine Shakti. In Chinese Taoist thought, it is the eternal dance of the feminine yin and the masculine yang. They're not opposites in conflict, but complementary forces that need one another to be whole. The yin-yang symbol, it shows a circle divided in two, black and white, feminine and masculine, each containing a small dot of the other. It is the essence of balance. There is no pure masculinity without a touch of the feminine. And there is no true femininity without a spark of the masculine. Yin and yang, they're inseparable. You cannot have light without dark, softness without hardness, stillness without movement. Likewise, you cannot have women without men or men without women. So let me be clear. Yin-Yang feminism does not mean a return to old stereotypes or rigid gender roles. It does not mean women must always be soft or men must always be strong. It is not about domination by either gender. Masculine and feminine, they actually exist in every person, which is why, as we were talking, there's a lot of this overlap. We all know women who have more yang energy, and we also know men who have more yin, feminine energy. A female could be decisive, ambitious, and powerful while still honoring and embracing her feminine sensuality. A man could be nurturing, emotional, and gentle while still honoring his masculine strength. When we accept this duality in ourselves and in each other, we step out of the battle of the sexes and more into a partnership of equals. Both sexes today, well, both sexes forever exist in relation to each other. Both contribute essential energies, and when either is devalued, society suffers. When the masculine and feminine energies are integrated and balanced, we create healthier relationships, families, and societies. And if we want a more peaceful, compassionate world, it is important to create balance between the masculine and the feminine, the yin and the yang. That is the essence of yin-yang feminism. It can be a path towards pleasure and peace between the genders through balance. Do you agree that men and women are interdependent rather than adversaries? Why or why not? Anyone could go for it?
I'll go for it.
Go for it.
I wouldn't use the term interdependent. I would use the term that you used just a couple of minutes ago, complementary.
Got it. Yes.
And I feel like each gender is whole without the other, but together they're even stronger.
Separate but equal and complementary. Does that summarize it?
Could you please explain what exactly do you mean by yin-yang feminism? What does it look like?
So what it is that when I was traveling and being in different countries, what I noticed is certain countries and cultures, they had a more cooperative approach between the genders. Of course, there was inequality and there was a fight for equality, but it was much more in a less confrontational mode. So to give one example, Filipina feminism is a really interesting one. Women, they fought for equality in their way, but in a very cooperative way and in a very caring way. They've had a female president, but they do honor the masculine as well. And there is a lot less of this ideological clash than the American model, where it's toxic masculinity, rape culture, men are just objectifying, and it's the language used in the American model is very confrontational. And in other models, there is more of an interplay, an honoring and respecting of the other. Like I've literally had conversations in America where, you know, women are like, we don't need men, men are pigs, men are this, men are that. And just like this even when I point out some of the deaths and the statistics about male deaths, there are females who've looked at me in the face and said, yeah, good. You know, like, I'm like, wow, there's very little of that honoring of the other side. And I've very seldom met a man who said, we don't need women. I've met multiple women who said, we don't need men, you know? And so that confrontational style was where I began to see, and I've seen it in voting records, in, you know, the way that women and men, and I'll be talking about those in other presentations, how politically you're getting a division now where women are voting more left, men are voting more right. And there are a bunch of splits that are happening on many different issues, often along gender lines. Go ahead. Yes.
Sorry, just another question. I'm not very knowledgeable in the history of feminism, but I'm just wondering how much the history of feminism specifically, if we take this word, is aligned with the history of voting rights, or just generally speaking rights in the society. Because I know certain things, for example, about the status of women in many Muslim cultures, and it sounds absolutely terrible. So knowing about your background, I understand where you're coming from, but the status of the woman in general in the society, is it always related to this keyword feminism, which has a very specific historical origin, and, you know, this migration history from France to English speaking countries?
Yes. Yeah, it is. So it started in France, came to America and England, and then from there it spread into the world. So it is, it's a word that is familiar everywhere I've said it. People are pretty familiar with the word now. So it did that migration. Now, in places like in the Eastern Europe, where there was communism, they didn't go that way because communism itself has that egalitarian principle of men and women being equal. It didn't quite always work out that way, but at least in theory, there was the concept in communism of the genders being equal. So there was different language around it. But the concept of feminism in the Western context, it started in the West, and it grew, it spread from there.
So what you're saying that right now in the Western context and in any culture which is significantly influenced by Western cultures, it is very difficult to completely ignore this idea of feminism, and we have to have some kind of idea of what we mean by feminism, because some people, different people use the word feminism in different ways, and they have different ideas under that label, and by pushing a little bit and shaping those ideas that people have under that label, we can achieve better societies in societies where this label is important.
Exactly. If feminism is used as a weapon, like as a cudgel, it tends to create a backlash, because when I speak to many men, when there's no women around, there are some horrible reactions against feminism. A lot of men hate it because they see it as just beating up men, because the adversarial framing that it started with has continued, and men are now reacting. Part of the election, I don't know where everyone stands politically, but part of the re-election of Donald Trump, I spoke to many people. I'm an American. I spoke to many people in America who voted for Trump, and there was a certain amount, and weirdly enough, even among women, who are reacting against American-style feminism, which is very confrontational. And so it made this backlash the other way. And that's where you see a lot of this split and war, where it's like it's a zero-sum game. What men gain, women lose. What women gain, men lose. And that's not the model that the original meaning of the word féminisme with French accent. It's not the original meaning of the French word. And in the ancient Indian and ancient Chinese meaning of the Shiva Shakti or Yin Yang, it's not that meaning, where it's more of a complementariness. Equality, but complementary. There's differences, but there's also, especially, and that's why I love the Yin Yang more than even the Shiva Shakti, because there is that element of each in the other so it makes it much more complementary rather than confrontational. And that's why I'm using the word Yin Yang, because it right away takes a lot of the confrontation out of it.
Mhm.
And when I go in, in the upcoming months, as I go into the other sections, I will elaborate more on that, but going into other areas of politics and how women relate and men relate on different issues, from psychology to, political issues, how we can frame it in a different way so that it's much more cooperative rather than confrontational.
Mhm.
Does that kind of answer it?
Yeah.
Yeah. Go for it, Karen.
I would just like to add, confrontation can come in different forms. And I have been very active since the 80s in wanting to see the two genders more cooperative. And I totally agree. My experience with the history of feminism is in the United States is that it has been very confrontational. What I'm seeing starting to happen now is a different type of interaction, or I should say lack of interaction, which I feel is also confrontational in a different way. And that is women and men refusing to talk to each other, just cutting each other out of their lives completely. And that's not going to get us anywhere either. It kind of follows the political model that's going on right now in this country. And it's really sad to me. And I'm very concerned about that, because if we stop talking, that's really bad.
I 100% agree with you. That's what I've been seeing as well. Dating has gone down. Male virginity has gone up. The two groups are not dating, they're not socializing, they're not hanging out. Many women, I watch YouTube video after YouTube video of women and men complaining what it's like at the workplace now, that everybody's walking on eggshells, nobody's giving compliments, no more flirting. There's so many areas in which the separation is happening. And as I go through each module, I go into things like the workplace, dating, socialization, and all of them, there's that cleavage that you're talking about that's happening. And it's not helping either group. When I go into the psychology in the future, it's that's one of the aspects. Both sides are psychologically not very happy in today's world. If anyone wants to just share a word or a sentence about how you feel about the presentation, I'm happy to hear it from you all, because I'm open to the feedback. Each month, I'll be doing the group. I'll be taking on a different chapter, a different area, but I'm very interested. As you can imagine, as a guy doing this, it's a little bit scary. So I want to make sure that I'm getting the tone right so I don't get crucified. As you can imagine, running an eco-feminist community, I had the same challenge, and it was always like, whoa, I'm a guy doing this. This is interesting, but at the same time, it worked out really well. And in the end, some of my greatest defenders when I ran the community were women. And that felt really good. And it's definitely been the inspiration for me wanting to do this workshop and this group. So Amanda, I'll let you start. You're at the top of the screen.
But overall, I like the different part that you explained about the historical context before diving directly into the subject of yin yang. it's always good to remember where we are from to know how we can learn from the lessons and go better. So I feel like it was great also to have spaces between the different parts if we had different questions, because usually it's just someone speaking for a full hour and a half and it's hard to get back with the question. So that's my point of view.
I was deliberately like, I've got to put a pause at the end of each section to make sure and give everyone a chance to communicate. Yes, so
Yeah,
thank you for that.
joining.
I appreciate that. But Asia?
Yes, I think nothing that you say really comes off as confrontational. So I think the overall tone so far is okay. I don't think you have, of course, I don't know what you plan for your next chapters, but I don't think this one was that dangerous in terms of what could have happened.
When the volcano destroyed my place, it was like, what do I do now? And this feels like the most, the best thing that I came up with, that was born out of that experience. Karen?
Well, I agree with what the others have said so far. In particular, I like the fact that you did pause in between sections and let us discuss the section before we went on. I thought that was very helpful. And I also like seeing your face rather than a slide.
This was my first discussion group on this subject, and I really welcome you all to attend the next one. So I'm going to try to keep them on all different interesting and topical subjects that relate to what's going on in the world today, and slowly build this into an actual real dialogue that we can start having between the genders, and hopefully create some more yin-yang harmony. And on that note, I would love to say thank you, everyone. I really appreciate it.